Hi biologists! Let's start by looking at the learning objectives for this lesson. At the end of this lesson and following the biology syllabus, you should be able to define a tissue and exemplify it using 4 tissue types, 2 each from a plant and an animal. What does this actually mean? What are we trying to understand? Well, first of all, you have to be able to give the definition of a tissue. Following that, you have to be able to illustrate that definition or explain it or exemplify it using 4 examples. 2 examples have to be an example of a plant tissue and 2 examples have to be an animal tissue. Let's look at tissues. Before we concentrate on the definition of a tissue, which is a learning objective of this lesson, let's remind ourselves of the concept of organization. Organization is the way living things are arranged into cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, individuals and populations to fulfill their functional need for metabolism and continuity. What does this mean for our lesson today? Well, it means that we've already met the concept or the idea that cells are organized into tissues so that an organism can carry out its chemical reactions and so that life can continue. Therefore, the idea that cells are organized into tissues and tissues are organized into organs, which are organized into systems, which form an individual, and a collection of individuals forming a population is a fundamental or a basic concept behind the definition of a tissue. So what is the definition of a tissue? Well, a tissue is a group of similar cells. Now this is vital. We must understand that a tissue consists of similar cells. We must also understand that these similar cells are adapted or suited to carrying out the same function. So a tissue, S and S here, is a group of similar S cells that are adapted for carrying out the same, or S again, the same function. A simple tissue has only one type of cell, whereas a complex tissue has more than one type of cell. Xylem, phloem and blood are complex tissues as they consist of more than one type of cell. Now, the objective of our lesson is to exemplify the definition of a tissue using 4 tissue types. We have to explain or show that a tissue consists of similar cells adapted for carrying out the same function, and to exemplify this, we have to make use of 2 plant tissues. In this case, we're going to talk about dermal tissue and vascular tissue, and we have to exemplify or explain or illustrate the definition of a tissue using 2 examples of animal tissues. And in this case, we will use the example of connective tissue and nervous tissue. So what we will do next is we will work our way down through these 4 tissue types, and in each one we will aim to show that all the cells are similar to each other and that they're all adapted to carrying out the same function. Just to remind you, xylem, phloem and blood technically are complex tissues because they consist of more than one type of cell. So let's look at dermal tissue. Now, dermal tissue consists of a single layer of cells. In other words, dermal tissue is only one cell thick. Now we would have met dermal tissue before. It surrounds roots and stems and leaves. Now, if dermal tissue is being used to exemplify the definition of a tissue, we must be able to show that all the cells are similar and they're adapted to carrying out the same function. All dermal cells are similar because they all have a nucleus, they have cytoplasm, and they have a vacuole. They form a single layer, and it's found, as we've said already, on the outside of roots. We met that before in the cross-section or transverse section of a root, where the dermal tissue was the outside tissue. We met it in the transverse section of a monocot stem, where again the dermal tissue was the outside layer. We met it in the transverse section of a dicot stem, again forming the outside layer. And we met it in the transverse section of a leaf. Again, the dermal tissue, a single layer of cells, is found on the upper and lower epidermis of a leaf. Dermal tissue cells have a similar structure because they have no chloroplasts. It is sometimes covered in a cuticle or waxy layer. So in a nutshell, dermal tissue exemplifies the definition of a tissue because it consists of similar cells and they are adapted with their slightly thickened cell walls to carry out the function of protection. The dermal tissue works to protect the stem and the root and the leaves against pathogens or the attack by microorganisms. Xylem tissue exemplifies the definition of a tissue as well, because it consists of similar cells. Xylem tissue is made up of vessel elements or cells. These cells are stacked one on top of the other, forming a hollow tube. The cells are dead, hollow, and very narrow. They have no end walls. They have thick, spiral-patterned lignin cell walls instead of cellulose. This lignin provides support for the xylem cells. They also have pits which allow the passage of water from cell to cell. So therefore we can see that xylem vessels exemplify the definition of a tissue because all the cells are similar, they have a similar structure, and they are adapted and work together to carry out the function of transporting water and minerals in a flowering plant. Just as a reminder, we met this xylem tissue in the transverse section of a root. We met it in the vascular bundles in the transverse section of a monocot stem, in the vascular bundles of a transverse section of a dicot stem, and in the vein in the transverse section of a leaf. You might like to see the videos on plant anatomy or plant structure to remind yourself of these parts of a plant. So in a nutshell, xylem tissue exemplifies the definition of a tissue because it consists of similar cells that are adapted for carrying out the same function. What about animal tissues? Well, the two types of animal tissue that we're going to look at are connective tissue and nervous tissue. Looking at connective tissue, we see that it consists of cells that are embedded or spread out in a non-living matrix or substance. Blood, bone, and cartilage are all examples of connective tissue. In cartilage, the matrix is rubbery. In bone, the matrix is hard. and in blood the matrix is liquid or plasma. So let's look at blood as an example of a tissue and use blood to exemplify the definition of a tissue. Therefore, we have to show that blood consists of similar cells working together to carry out the same function. So blood consists of, for example, red blood cells. All these cells are similar to each other because they have no nucleus, they are biconcave or hollow, and they have hemoglobin, which is the red pigment for carrying oxygen. These cells have a similar structure as we have just said. They are adapted for bringing oxygen to body systems. So they carry out the same function. In general, connective tissue will hold the body together like cartilage and help support it, perhaps by supplying oxygen as blood does. The other animal tissue which we will use to exemplify the definition of a tissue is nervous tissue. Again, we want to show that this tissue consists of similar cells that are adapted for carrying out the same function. Nervous tissue consists of cells called neurons, and each of these neurons have a cell body with a nucleus and cytoplasm. Each of these neurons have dendrites that receive signals and have axons, another type of projection, which will transmit electrical signals to other cells. So, irrespective of whether the neuron is a motor nerve, a sensory nerve, or an interneuron, we will see that each of these nerve cells have a similar structure. They all have a cell body, they all have dendrites, and they all have axons, thus illustrating the fact that nervous tissue consists of similar cells. All these cells unite or work together or are adapted for carrying electrical impulses around the body. So, in a nutshell, these four types of tissue: dermal tissue, xylem tissue, connective tissue, principally blood, and nervous tissue, all exemplify the definition of a tissue, because each of these tissues consist of similar cells that are adapted for carrying out the same function. And there you have it. Practice in a jotter. Now that we have reached the end of our lesson, have we achieved our objective? Can you define a tissue? Can you exemplify it using 4 tissue types, 2 each from a plant and an animal?